Welcome, everyone, to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Ray Briggs. They are professor of philosophy at Stanford University, and their work is focused on a range of topics, including chance and decision theory, epistemology, ethics, and gender. Their book, co-authored with B.R. George, is What Even Is Gender?, published by Routledge and is now available. That's going to be our focus for today, and I'll include some links to that in the description. But with that, feel free to add anything. And welcome, and thanks so much for being here, Professor Briggs.
Thank you so much for having me here, Troy.
Awesome. So I had a chance to read this book, and I really enjoyed it. And again, the book is called What Even Is Gender? And I just wanted to start by asking, like, who would you say this book is for and not for? And sort of what are the central aims of the book?
Right. So this book is kind of for people who are maybe confused about questions of gender in their own lives, or who want to be supportive of trans rights but are like confused about some of the things people say around trans rights, but are sort of like looking for a kind of broadly trans supportive framework that makes sense, and it's intervening in a kind of an atmosphere of dialogue that often doesn't make sense and is like, there's got a lot of things wrong with it, but we think one of the things that's wrong with it is it's sort of got these concepts that support sort of confusions about what gender is, what transness is, what everybody's relationship with the kind of massive stuff that goes by the name of gender is or should be or can be. So we just want to like untangle some of the mess and clear some ground.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I agree that's a worthwhile project there. So as we kind of getting into it, what the target of the project is here, I had a kind of general question to try to situate the project. So like,
Yes.
I'm going to try to introduce this, but it's along the kind of descriptive versus prescriptive divide here. So like, there's on one hand the more descriptive investigation, like we're trying to figure out how gender terms are used in kind of normal, or at least some domain of gender thought and talk, the various associations and expectations people have with various like gender terms and categories, and the feelings and attitudes and experiences associated with them, and so on and so on. But then there's also the more kind of prescriptive project, which aims at something like revising or expanding or making more precise or doing away with certain thought and talk, often for like linguistic or social or political ends. Where do you see your project or projects along this distinction?
Right. So I don't think that we are describing how people in fact use language. Like, that's not the project. So we definitely talk a bit about like ways that people could use language, but I don't think we're just talking about like how people ought to use language ideally either. We're partly talking about the reality that the language describes. So like, one thing that your concepts or language can have wrong with them is that they encourage you to ignore aspects of an underlying reality, or they encourage you to conflate different aspects of an underlying reality. So we're more on the describing. So part of what we do is describe some ways that our language could work. And we do have some political aims with those descriptions, but one of our aims is just kind of alethic. Like, how do you come up with language that is good for capturing the underlying reality?
Yeah, that makes sense. It seems to me to get a bit tricky though, because like, then the question is like, which aspects of the underlying reality are you trying to capture, right?
Right. Because there is never a neutral description of reality that treats everything as equally important. And I don't think you'd want to treat everything as equally important, because that doesn't reflect how most people operate. So we are, so we're making, so I think we're doing something weaker than making a prescription about how everyone must talk. We're making some suggestions about how everyone might talk that they don't already, that might be useful. So I see the book as very much kind of in the business of opening up the ability to consider more possibilities rather than foreclosing possibilities. I think like philosophy has valuable business doing both of those things. When you prove something, you kind of foreclose possibilities where the premises are true and the conclusion falls. And that's like a worthy project, but it's mostly not what we're doing in the book.
Good. Yeah. I think, I think my kind of feel I got while reading it is reflects that. Yeah. So like really you have some suggestions regarding, okay, here's some maybe useful distinctions to make, and here's some maybe ways to draw up the categories this way, roughly speaking. But and there's certain motivations for doing it that way, but it's neither a matter of purely descriptive enterprise, like this is how it's actually working already, or it's like, or something really strong, like everyone must exactly use it this way, or something like that. It's something in between.
Right. Yeah. I also like, I don't think anybody has adequate epistemic or other authority to tell everyone how they must use language. That assumes knowledge of totality facts that I don't think any human being on earth has.
Right. Yeah. So, and another thing, just before I get into some of the, for the content in the book, like something that I feel that you're sensitive to, but doesn't really come up at much length in the book, is the issues of like historical development of gender thought and talk, and then like cross-cultural stuff, or like in other languages and communities of the, understand that understanding of gender thought and talk. And I could see how both these might be useful for the project here, but I don't know. What do you think about that? And you think it would be useful to cover that more? Or?
Yeah, I think like this is one of these like there's so much fascinating stuff here, and I don't want to overstep my expertise. Is mostly what it is, like the history of even a few gender concepts, or the cross-cultural comparison of even a few gender concepts, is something that I feel like kind of a dilettante in rather than an expert in. And maybe it's a little bit of a dilettantist book. My co-author is actually trained as a linguist. So they are kind of fascinated by grammatical markers, including gender markers, because it's a thing that languages do. So they were very sort of they were very insistent about making sure that all of our diacritical marks were correct, for instance. Sorry, I'm not sure that I answered your question directly. Could you sort of say whatever part of your question I didn't?
Well, it's fine. It's just about like how kind of useful do you think that sort of investigation, the cross-cultural stuff, the historical stuff, would be in like understanding gender and gender categories?
Yes, so I think basically pretty useful because I don't think it's easy to come up with sort of an accurate picture of what gender thought and talk is doing a priori. And so asking, where did this come from? How do other people do this? Gives you a sort of deeper sense of the possibilities, I think. On the other hand, like it's one of these like cases where the theory observation distinction is not totally clear. And even the little bit of like cross-cultural stuff that we pulled in sort of made that really obvious. So what is the title of Oyewumi's book? I always forget this. The Invention of Woman. Or sorry, the book The Invention of Women. About the concept of the absence of concepts like woman and man in Yoruba culture is critiquing earlier anthropologists who are mostly like coming at it from a white European context of misinterpreting sort of various Yoruba practices through their own lens. So if that kind of misinterpretation is possible, that suggests that you can't just go observe something and assume that your observations are uncontaminated by your own background assumptions. So I think the possibilities of these like cross-cultural misunderstandings is one of the things that makes me a little nervous about sort of the ability, like my ability to do anything straightforwardly comparative. So I think that like any observations of how people treat or don't treat gender concepts in the past or in other cultures are going to be loaded with kind of the observer's assumptions. I don't see a way around that. So I haven't given a very clear argument for that here, but that's kind of the background assumption that I'm bringing.
Yeah, no, I see that for sure. There's that concern, and it's probably even like maybe more concerned in just how to like conduct research, be it like it's just like this methodological concerns. I mean, I see something similar in when it comes up in like gauging people's like ethical and meta-ethical beliefs and intuitions, especially like cross-culturally. And it's like how much of the way you interpret the responses they're giving is influenced by the sort of assumptions you bring to bear and so on. It's, hard to really understand that.
Yeah. Another source that I thought was really kind of helpful for thinking this stuff through was Jules Gill Peterson's Histories of the Transgender Child, which so Oronke Oyewumi's The Invention of Woman does a kind of cross-cultural comparison, and then Histories of the Transgender Child is doing this kind of cross-historical look at how gender and transness have been framed in like mostly American culture. And so I think both of these are such like histories of misunderstanding. And also it's funny, like I think that this just kind of comes up in general as a question about sort of the relation between observation and theory. This is a kind of instance of a more general problem, where on the one hand, you need to be looking at the world to get an adequate theory of it. But on the other hand, you're looking at the world is never going to be it's never going to tell you anything that's independent of the theory you started with. So you've got to, take your little Neurath's boat and replace each plank of it until it hopefully becomes a better seaworthy vessel.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot that could be said about these issues, but yeah, I want to kind of jump into some stuff from the book. So, like, first, I just wanted to bring to light sort of a recurring complaint I see in this book. It was something that comes up especially towards the end, like chapter 5, I believe, where you don't think that. Look, there's a lot of the existing discourse, and discussion on these topics, both folk and professional, that treats it as if like there's some clear and fixed, almost like abstract form of what we're getting at, right? Like there's something that's maybe going to be amenable to like necessary and sufficient conditions, that's univocal, and everyone's just having substantive disputes about what the features associated with it are, to do with, say, womanness or manness or other gender terms and categories, and you want to definitely reject that, at least something of that strength. I don't know if you want to talk about that concern and like what's really going on here.
Yeah. So we kind of start with a bunch of what we call problematic slogans about gender. So things like gender is the social interpretation of sex, or gender is male and female, and sex is man and woman, or gender is what's between your ears, not what's between your legs. And so you take all of these slogans, and it looks like all of them are true of something, but it doesn't look like there's anything of which they are all true. So this suggests that the word gender just is not univocal, that there's a bunch of different stuff that it could refer to. So trying to figure out what the one thing that is gender is kind of a red herring. So yeah, so the stuff that people say about gender all seems to be, each of those things seems to be true of something, but there's nothing that they all seem to be true of. Like that suggests that we shouldn't look for one thing called gender.
Yeah. That makes sense. I mean, I think you touched on this briefly in the book, but like, what about the reply according to which, in a way, gender thought and talk is it's like really messy and varied and so on that to some degree all of these slogans are sort of true of it, but it is still really this one thing, something like that. I mean, what do you think about an approach that really tries to not splinter gender into these different concepts or something like that, but tries to accommodate? Yeah.
Right. So I think I would want a reason why we should believe in one best deserver. And I guess I have a reason why we shouldn't believe that there must be a single best deserver. My reason for not believing that is that if you think that all of the problematic slogans are true of one thing, then your theoretical term gender, when you introduce Briggs principles to talk about its relationship to other things, is going to enable you to infer falsehoods that don't have the theoretical term gender anywhere in them. So, for instance, if you think that gender is about being masculine or feminine, and you think, cisgender people identify with the gender they were assigned at birth, then it looks like cisgender people have to identify with masculinity or femininity. And then you're like, well, what about all the cis men who aren't super big on being hypermasculine, or all the cis women who think that femininity is kind of oppressive? It looks like if you put together two claims about gender that are about different things, and you assume that they're about the same thing, then you can infer falsehoods that don't have the word gender in them at all. Like cisgender women all identify with being feminine.
Good. Yeah, that makes sense. I guess maybe the suggestion might be that the slogans are sort of, maybe many of them are just kind of approximately true or capturing some aspect of these gender categories or terms, but they're not to be taken too seriously so as to support these sorts of inferences or something like that.
Right. I mean, I think that we've got one explanation of how they might be true or approximately true and not support these inferences, which is that the term gender is not univocal. So I think I'd want a positive reason for thinking that it was univocal.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. I mean, I guess part of the issue here is going to be like, how do we even tell whether a given discourse is like, you're using the same word in different ways or on different occasions, or you're using it in kind of the same way, but the kind of quote unquote way that it's being used is kind of messy and kind of varied. I'm not sure there's going to be something. Maybe it doesn't really matter that much what we say, but I guess I see the point.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I maybe one of my background assumptions is that most concepts are not univocal, and that's fine. And one thing philosophers are doing is kind of coming up with explications of concepts where the explication is univocal, and so the explication isn't really equivalent to the original concept. But that's all right. The explication is meant to give you like one precise model of something the concept is doing. Like I think that you see this all the time in logic, actually. So I don't think the logician's and is the English language and or any language's conjunction. But I think it captures a really cool aspect of conjunction.
Good. Yeah. I was gonna bring some stuff up about like, explication and maybe like engineering and stuff as well. Yeah. So I do want to cover some of the like distinctions and topics that get brought up in the book, and one thing that comes up fairly early on are this notions of gender traits and gender feels. And so as I understood it, gender traits are roughly features of individuals associated with like gender terms and categories, but I mean, excluding like subjective feelings and mental attitudes and dispositions. Whereas gender feelings, on the other hand, are like feelings and mental attitudes and dispositions, like regarding the fact or prospect of oneself possessing some or other gender trait. Is this roughly right? I mean, could you expand a bit on the distinction here and why you think it's helpful?
Yeah, so maybe I should motivate it a bit more. So really this kind of came from us worrying about like what the heck does it mean to say somebody quote identifies as a non-binary, a man, a woman, and deciding that look, we understand what like woman, man, and non-binary are. Those are like social categories that you can be recognized to belong to. We understand lots of like individual traits that get gendered in our society. So lots of behavioral traits, wearing makeup, raising children, fixing muscle cars, wearing neckties, um, certain styles of communication. So each of those behavioral traits is kind of something that an individual can have or not have. They're also kind of we think of as biological traits, which are possibly hazily individuated from behavioral traits once you recognize that people do things like shave and get electrolysis. So things like body hair are a physical trait that is gendered. Um, Things like what kind of genitals you have, whether you can gestate babies are also physical traits that are gendered, but like lots of things that go by the name of secondary sexual characteristics are gendered as well. So there are all these traits, and then it seems like the concept of the concept of gender identity or identifying as is meant to pick out like feelings of people toward those traits. So that's cool. Like feelings are intentional attitudes. They're about something, and in the case of what we call gender feels, which are meant to kind of do the work of gender identity, feelings are about your relationship to something, your kind of individual relationship to something. So, uh, so we were really kind of interested in how to parse out the subjective aspects of the big lump that gets called gender. And we thought, oh, these are intentional attitudes, and that explains why they're so varied, because intentional attitudes can be about lots of different things. So does that help to motivate it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the first thing potential worry that someone might have though is that like aren't some of those kind of subjective things, including the intentional attitudes, feelings, dispositions, and so on, aren't those also kind of just gender traits also? Like why are we separating them into a different group here?
Yeah, so I think like all of these things get called gender. Some of them are sort of more public. So like the shape of my body is something that might not have anything to do with how I see myself. It's something that like others kind of can perceive and use to classify me. Whereas so gender feels, they're not private. Like other people can understand my gender feels because I can talk to them, or I can sort of give nonverbal cues about how I'm feeling, but they're subjective. And so we're kind of it's not that these two things are completely disconnected from each other. In fact, we define gender feels in terms of gendered traits. If there weren't any gendered traits for us to perceive, then we couldn't have any kinds of attitudes about them. But it's useful to notice that they're distinct, partly because we want to kind of clear room for talking about the subjective stuff that just doesn't just collapse it to the public stuff.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's going to get a bit. I'm going to have another question about this as when we come to like gender norms and stuff like that. But just one more thing on the on the gender traits and gender feel stuff. I was wondering, is like one benefit of this, or maybe an upshot of this, is that it because we're looking at the underlying phenomena here in a more fine-grained way, we're gaining more like gender relevant information, and we're finding that it's more complex perhaps than our simple gender terminology and categories might have initially led us on, right? If that makes sense. And so I mean, what do you think? That's right?
Yeah, no, and I think that's right, and I think that's desirable. So I think it's desirable, first of all, for trans people because thinking of gender as this single, simple, unitary thing encourages gatekeeping. So it kind of encourages sort of medical professionals to not give somebody the resources to transition unless they can demonstrate their like socially acceptable masculinity or femininity in other ways. It encourages people not to recognize trans people's identities unless they conform to sort of prevailing expectations of having all the traits that are supposed to be masculine or feminine. But also, I think it's good. It's not just good for trans people. I think it's good for cis people not to think I am a woman, so I have to like this list of stuff, or I am a man, so I have to behave in this list of ways, or sort of my body is not adequately masculine or feminine because it doesn't match some template. So I think one of the big motivations is just clearing room for individual variation, which introducing like nuance and complexity, I hope will do.
Yeah, that seems right to me. And maybe that's part of a way to kind of motivate the account that you're developing here, or at least motivate recognizing the distinctions that you want to draw here. So yeah.
No, I'm in favor.
So yeah, and then, but then as you mentioned, talk of gender identity as well, and you, what I'm going to ask, you sort of already started to answer, but maybe we could talk more about this, which is that again, it's maybe surprising for somebody writing on gender that they are fairly critical of a lot of talk in terms of gender identities. And you prefer to talk in terms of gender fields and some other related concepts here. Could you talk a bit more about maybe some of the shortcomings of gender identity talk and why you think some of these other ways of talking, including in terms of gender fields, is maybe better suited to capture personal associations with gender and so on?
Yeah. So I think that the trouble with gender identity is that you're supposed to have exactly one of them. And it's supposed to do a lot of explanatory work. So it's supposed to explain how you want your body to be, how you want to be seen by others, why you behave in ways that others perceive as masculine or feminine, and how you ought to be categorized as like a man, a woman, non-binary. And those things don't all have a common explanation because they can come apart, and it's kind of important to recognize that they can come apart. So somebody can think of themselves as a woman, but not want to have stereotypically womanly physical features. They can be a woman and not have stereotypically womanly physical features. And so I don't think the concept of gender identity allows for the level of real variation in personal relationships to gender that we actually find in the world. And that's a problem if gender identity is supposed to be kind of the marker of whether your desire to medically transition is legitimate or your desire to be called, say, non-binary is legitimate. If you need this thing to legitimate you that doesn't exist, that's bad.
Right. Yeah. So the way you say that, it reminds me of some. I mean, this comes up elsewhere too. Like for example, with like political affiliation. Like if someone calls themselves, say, a Democrat or a liberal or whatever, that might try to. It's almost like there's stuff expected of them by belonging to that label, which might not actually really capture the nuance of their views or the nuance of their attitudes on certain things. Right. So. Maybe something similar going on.
Yeah, I think that there's probably a critique of identity in general that you could draw out of this.
Yeah.
And I'd kind of be broadly in favor of that.
Yeah, insofar as the identities are sort of oversimplifying or boxing their self or their certain facts about themselves and commitments in a way which doesn't actually reflect the what's going on in them or the more subtle details. And that can be,
Yes.
Of course, maybe there's some trade-off here. Okay, some level of categories or identities, insofar as they're useful, might be fine, even if we recognize some of the shortcomings. But insofar as those shortcomings or certain other problematic outcomes, repression and so on, are a consequence, then it's something to pay attention to, perhaps.
Yeah, and I do want to clarify that we are not opposed to all of the things that currently get called gender identity. We're opposed to lumping them together under the single term gender identity. So, like, we think people really do have strong feelings about how their bodies ought to be configured, and they have strong feelings about how others classify them, and those strong feelings are legitimate, and we call those feelings gender feels. It's just that those feelings don't have to match up in the way that the concept of gender identity requires.
Right. Yeah, I think you say, like, in passing or something, that, like, maybe there's some uses of or ways to make it more precise that you would have no problems with. I remember there's like the norm relevance view. Maybe there's something to make out of that. That's perfectly fine. Or something else. But your critique is with maybe this treating it as normally treated, in the kind of everything's got lumps into these gender categories and it has to serve these roles and so on.
Yeah. In fact, like, any one of the disambiguations of this ambiguous term might be fine if everybody could settle on that being the way to use it.
Yeah, but of course this is the other issue too, which is that, like, I don't know, I feel like there is a significant amount of variation and vagueness and sometimes inconsistency in the way that people use, language generally, but gendered language for our purposes here. How much of that is a concern to you, or something that you think is relevant to the like theorizing here?
Yeah, so I think that any adequate theorizing has to somehow accept the reality of vagueness and inconsistency in language use. Like, I don't want this to be a book that says, here is a list of the acceptable or politically appropriate ways to use words, because I think that's a bad project. So this is kind of one of the reasons why I like focusing on a little bit more on the metaphysics and epistemology rather than on kind of trying to precisely define anything. So we give definitions in the book. We say, here's what we think gender feels are. We argued quite a bit over whether to give definitions. And I was the more pro definition person, and I was like, we need to gloss terms so that people understand roughly what we're saying, but these shouldn't be taken as something so load bearing that any data that is inconsistent with our definition ought to be dismissed. Like, I would rather say, oh, we used words a little bit wrong, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, that's fair. And you also say things like the way you kind of carve up the the categories of gender feels and gender traits. That's not like, you don't have to necessarily carve them up precisely that way. It's just like maybe one useful way to do it that you do for the sake of explaining some of the ideas here. Is that roughly what you're saying there?
So I think that's related, but I think there was something more specific we had in mind, which is that we're illustrating a kind of formal move that you could make that I think the closest I've seen anybody come to it is Mari Mikkola, where we've got gendered traits, which we can divide up into sort of sex biology and gendered practice and gender categories or gender category membership. So we've got traits and we've got feels about those traits. And so our buckets of traits, so we've got 3 buckets of traits. And I don't think the individuation of types of traits is very important or deep. But like the idea that you could divide gendered traits from each other and maybe group them together is sort of more general than the implementation of like, here is a list of 3 that we're dividing the territory up into. So the number 3 is not as special as you could divide gendered traits up into different clusters. And then gender feels, we say, are about gendered traits. So we think the distinction between feels and traits in the story about their relationship is really important. And then dividing up gendered traits gives you a corresponding way of dividing up gender fields. So every field is about a trait. So you can, if you've got biology traits and behavior traits, then you can also have biology fields, which are about biology traits, and behavior fields, which are about behavior traits. So so having this division of traits kind of induces a way of dividing up fields and distinguishing them from each other. And so that is much more important to us than the exact way of individuating traits and the corresponding exact way of individuating fields. Just like, oh, there's a kind of interesting representation relation between some of these things and others of these things. And it gives us a way of like drawing distinctions.
Yeah, okay, that's good. And then on just one more thing on gender fields. I wonder, let me think of the right way to put this. Couldn't you have gender fields about other gender fields? So like, I don't know, couldn't you feel about a certain way about say you having a certain emotional response or attitude or disposition, maybe this makes sense, or
Yes, this does make sense. So we don't talk about that in the book. So we assume that every gender feel is about one trait, which is probably an oversimplification. So maybe you have a gender feel like, gosh, my beard really offsets how great this skirt looks when it twirls. It's a really good combination. And that's sort of a feel about some pairing of gender traits. And then you've suggested, well, maybe you could have a feel like, wow, I really dislike how happy it makes me when somebody uses he pronouns for me. I think like that's kind of suspicious, and I just like what it says about me. And so that might also be a gender feel, even though it's not about one of the traits directly. So once you see that, like, you have this way of building feels from like attitudes and objects, I think you might think we've missed some of the potential attitudes or some of the potential objects. And I'm kind of happy to, like, I don't think we've given an exhaustive list. I think we've given a pretty good starter list. But in general, like, I'm really happy for people to point out ways in which this wasn't exhaustive.
Yeah, very good. I definitely, that seems all very fair. But yeah, I mean, and you could also just say, like, maybe to some degree, this is still it's a simplification maybe, and it can get more complicated than maybe what it's on, but that doesn't, you're not prohibiting people or yourself developing it to make it more precise or to cover these other sorts of cases that we want to cover or something like that. That makes sense.
Yeah. So I think what we've done here is like give you some taxonomy tools and not give you the definitive correct way to apply those tools.
Right. And then you also talk about like gender norms, and those are kind of roughly on the account here, to use your terminology, social expectations linking to a more gendered traits, which is considered generally applicable or binding. I want to have a couple of questions about abolitionism, which I'll get to in a moment. But so first, like, what are some of the problems with gender norms like this, and how are they going to be relevant to the understanding of gender here?
Right. So a lot of what feminists have written about gender is neither just about gendered traits nor about gender feels, but about sort of expectations that sort of women will all behave in this one way that indicates that they're subordinate to men, or men will all behave in this one way that indicates that they should be in charge of the world, or women of this particular race and class status will behave in these particular ways. So a lot of what is oppressive about the stuff that people call gender is attempts to enforce conformity on people, usually. So we don't talk about the ultimate aim of attempts to enforce conformity, because there are just like a lot of different perspectives that you could take on that. But attempts to enforce conformity without an adequate reason seem bad. And so we're happy to just name them and point out that they have bad effects and no good justification. And so gender norms are basically the cognitive part of attempts to enforce conformity. So they are expectations that people will sort of if they are women, conform to physical and behavioral expectations of femininity. If they are men, conform to physical and behavioral expectations of masculinity. Not be both women and men, or neither women nor men at all. So they're considered to be generally applicable or binding, because that's what an attempt to enforce conformity has to be.
Yeah.
We don't think they're universally binding,
right.
Which I can talk about also. Yeah.
Right. It's just like a general kind of attitude or association that gets made with these norms. And yeah, a fair amount of, I mean, some of the negative effects of these norms are like pretty obvious. Of course, there might be some positive cases too, but yeah, I mean, I did want to just one more thing about well, maybe a couple more things about norms here. But this is sort of returning to what I've already said about fields, which is that couldn't gender fields also be potential relata of norms, of gender norms?
Yeah. So this is something that we kind of briefly acknowledge the possibility of, but don't really explore in the book. So an expectation that like all trans people will identify real hard with one of two binary genders, and feel themselves always to be a member of that gender, I guess is, yeah, I think actually the category of transness doesn't really appear anywhere in our taxonomy, but you could think that's if that's a gendered trait of some sort, then demanding that certain people have certain gender feels could certainly be a norm. Maybe if you want to wear a pretty dress, you also have to want to have a curvy figure. That would be a plausible norm regulating gender feels. So yeah, we don't explicitly talk about those norms. We focus more on norms relating traits that the fields are about. But again, we've given you the tools. Once you've recognized that norms are kind of intentional attitudes that link to things, you might think we haven't named all of the relevant things that can be linked in our book, and you can build more and talk about them.
Yeah, fair enough. Sure. So then this kind of leads into one potential response to gender issues that you discuss, but don't adopt, which is called gender abolitionism. Now,
yes.
Abolitionists think that we should abolish or at least significantly revise or replace existing gender thought and talk. And one common motivation for this is that the existing thought and talk and the associations and behavior that tend to come along with it is more harmful and oppressive than it is kind of good and useful. And eliminating or significantly revising it would help to eliminate or at least mitigate those harmful effects. Before I get to the other motivation, I mean, what do you think about this sort of case that the abolitionists make along those lines?
Right. So I think our line is not that abolitionism is wrong, but that abolitionism is ambiguous, because if the concept of gender is multiply ambiguous, then the concept of abolishing gender inherits all that ambiguity. So you really have to ask, which thing should we abolish? And we think actually a lot of gendered norms are good targets for abolition. We should get rid of those. We don't think that a lot of gender traits are good targets for abolition. And we don't really think that gender categories are good targets for abolition. And so I think that's where kind of like the interesting discussion takes place, not should we abolish gender, because gender is too vague of a term for us to figure out if we should abolish it or not. But like, which things merit abolition and which don't?
Right. Yeah. I wonder if someone responded in the following sort of way. Yeah, true. Ultimately, what we'd most, want to get rid of here is these like harmful norms. But what if it might be the case that it's the easiest way to do that, to accomplish that, would be to also just kind of get rid of some of these gender categories and traits altogether. Like that might be an option there. But in other words, how would we go about eliminating these norms without trying to leave intact more or less kind of the categories and traits and gender traits and so on? Might not be so easy.
Right. So I think that there are some gendered traits that very few people want to abolish. So sexed biology, maybe Shulamit Firestone wanted to abolish some aspects of sexed biology, but most people don't actually. And so that then I guess that then there's a lot more disagreement on whether to abolish particular gendered behaviors, and we think the gendered behaviors that come in for the most abolitionist critique tend to be behaviors that are coded as feminine, and we're a little bit suspicious of that because many of those behaviors have valuable as well as like bad aspects. So taking care of children is coded as feminine and also essential work that should be recognized. It keeps society alive. Some of them are kind of morally neutral and things that people should be free to do. So I think that like wearing dresses and makeup is pretty morally neutral, and it's an unfair imposition on people's freedoms to abolish that. So I think for a lot of gendered behaviors, abolitionists are too quick to move from norms demanding this behavior should be abolished, which is often true, to this behavior should be abolished, which is often not true. So it's going to be probably a conversation for each behavior, but we're skeptical of that move in general. But I think the strongest case for abolition of something other than norms is abolition of gender categories. And we don't actually want to sign on to abolitionism about gender categories either. So I've given you two weak cases disagreeing with me, and I should probably talk about the strong case. I feel like I've set this up a little backwards.
Yeah, fair enough. No worries. I know there's a lot that you could get into there. I mean, I just yeah, I guess I'm sort of imagining someone approaching it this way, like, okay, you want to reduce or eliminate a lot of these gender norms, but then they're thinking, what's the best way to actually achieve that? And they might think that the best way to achieve that is by eliminating some gender talk or gender traits and so on.
Right. So I think I've given arguments for sort of at least hesitating on eliminating either sex biology or gendered behaviors, but that leaves gender categories, where I think a lot of people have had the thought, look, gender categories do a lot of work in mediating gender norms. So they are something that enables us to say that, oh, this shape of body should go with this behavior via sort of this is what a man looks like or this is what a woman looks like. So I think that is like a kind of pro tanto reason for maybe getting rid of gender categories. But we think that there's also a possible way of reinterpreting gender categories so that they no longer mediate those norms. So we think the gender categories are not analytically connected to any of those norms. They're merely kind of contingently connected to those norms. And, excuse me. Yeah, so we think that gender categories aren't essentially connected to gender norms. They're accidentally connected to gender norms. And that there is a way of imagining gender categories that no longer connects them to those norms. So there's a way of keeping gender categories around that gets rid of there's a way of keeping gender categories around, but not keeping gender norms around. We think that would be better. So I guess then the next question is, well, why think that? So there might be two ways to get rid of gender norms. One is while keeping gender categories around, and one is while getting rid of gender categories. So why think that the one that keeps gender categories around is better? And we think gender categories also do a lot of kind of positive meaning making work for people. I think so. We don't fully kind of refute the type of abolitionism that tries to get rid of gender categories. We just say, look, it doesn't follow from anything about the nature of gender categories that they must be abolished.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, it's tricky because maybe it turns into this difficult empirical or like pragmatic question of like,
right,
how do we go about, what's going to be more effective here? What's more likely to succeed? How do we implement the better outcome?
Yeah, and I think one of my kind of motivating thoughts that isn't really written down in the book is that it would be really hard to try to just get people to stop using gender categories, and that going after norms more directly might or might not result in the deaths of gender categories, and we'd have to see. And if a side effect of abolishing a bunch of oppressive gender norms is that those categories disappear as well, that's not the worst thing in the world, but that targeting the categories is not as promising as targeting the norms directly.
Yeah, that's a good point. I could see how the social change or the individual, change in terms of these norms and the associations and expectations that people have would be a little bit easier to change than maybe more deeply entrenched just like gendered language and categories more broadly. So I could see the point there.
Yeah, I think there's also a question of like, what does it concretely mean when people tell you they want to eliminate gender categories? And sometimes it means so here's the most promising version of that thought. We should stop printing M and F on people's identifying documents. And when we're like talking in medical contexts, we should just like require doctors to be more specific. Are you concerned about this person's hormone balance? Are you concerned that they might be pregnant? Are you concerned that they like might be at risk for breast cancer? Just talk about all of those individual factors. So I think that that's a kind of intriguing concept abolitionist position or category abolitionist position that would eliminate these categories as like administrative things. So that's one option. Another thing that people often seem to mean when they talk about abolishing categories is you shouldn't call yourself blah, 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 which I have less time for since it's so what I call myself is much less directly enforcing norms on anybody else than, say, what my legal documents require me to tell the government about myself. So I think there's kind of interesting questions to be explored about what category abolition would mean. And we don't really talk about that in the book, but I think it's cool.
Yeah, it's just sort of makes me think about, this other issue, which has to do with when our thought and talk here, there's maybe some trade-off between how kind of simple it is, how easy to use it is and learn it is, how kind of quickly we can apply it and so on, versus how, informative it is and how much it tells us about what's going on or we're trying to capture.
Yeah.
And what's the balance we want there? Because you might want something that's very simple that, oftentimes these basic gender categories might serve, but then that might be at the cost of being less precise or, potentially, not capturing certain phenomena underlying those, things in the way that we want to. So, I don't know, what do you think about this sort of trade-off here?
Right. So I think I'm kind of inclined to be specific to projects. So if I want to talk about sexism, the category woman is probably going to come into my conversation because it's, in a lot of contexts, a really useful summary of who a lot of the main targets of sexism are. So, and maybe like the cognitive content of a lot of sexist ideas as well. If I want to talk about sort of an individual in all their complexity, I might use more words and more complicated words. So I think it's also going to be partly dependent on audience, which set of concepts you use, and I think B and I elsewhere are very emphatically against having one set of words that you expect to work in all contexts as labels for all people. So we definitely don't think that the only interesting gender categories are woman and man, or that there's necessarily a problem with proliferating them.
Yeah, that seems pretty reasonable to me. I mean, like, you know, whether it, because the way I put it is like we're maybe trying to strike some balance between like informativeness and precision and like ease of use and simplicity, and what the right balance is might vary by context or what our aim is or what we're trying to capture, you know. And so to say that there's one kind of correct answer there is just kind of silly because it might vary in that way.
Yeah, I think that if you connect this to abolitionism, I think it raises further questions about what the motives for gender abolitionism are. So most people, when they talk about gender abolitionism, have political motives. And so you might think, look, whether these concepts adequately describe reality as it exists now doesn't exhaust the objections to them. So you might have concepts that accurately describe reality because people have been using them to describe reality for generations and therefore shaped reality, so it fits those concepts. And you might think, well, those are accurate concepts. They're good summaries, and that doesn't settle the question of whether we should keep them around, because having true beliefs is not our only aim.
Right. Yeah. So I did want to bring up another potential abolitionist motivation, which is something like, we might think that our existing kind of gender thought and talk is, and this goes back to something I've brought up already. We might think that our existing gender thought and talk is so vague, varied, imprecise, like confused, inconsistent, and so on, that it's actually like ill-suited to our relevant linguistic, conceptual, communicative, political, whatever purposes. And there's no good way to kind of revise it or make it more precise, so as to avoid these issues without just replacing it with something else. And so, you know, it's just ultimately we'd do better without it. You know, I mean, that's the kind of idea.
Yeah, that's a really different motivation, but yeah, that's also an option. And you know, B and I are on record for thinking something similar about the concept of gender identity, maybe minus the no good way to revive it or revise it. So there might be a good way to revise it. It just needs something done with it. So you could think that about either kind of traditional gender categories like woman and man, or kind of various other gender categories like non-binary or demigirl, that they don't really capture reality adequately. Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought about that as like an avenue for abolitionists to take. I think most of them take the political motivations rather than the epistemic motivations. Yeah. So one part of the book is us explaining how categories like non-binary man, woman might make sense, which is not yet a full argument that they make so much sense that there's no alternative conceptual scheme that does better or that we should replace them with, which is the very minimal. Here are how these categories make more sense than a lot of people give them credit for.
Yeah, fair enough. And so I was just thinking something else about the kind of simplicity versus informativeness thing that I was talking about, which is that, like, some people are in favor of having just as many gender categories as like we can, because there's distinctions that we can draw between these underlying phenomena, and why not attach a label to them to capture the different distinctions. But then other people are going to say, well, okay, you could do that, I suppose, but like now it just gets really complicated and unwieldy, and maybe it's like less efficient to and more difficult to understand and employ these terms and categories. So I don't know. I mean, it's just the same point, but like, what do you think about that? The disputes that people have there regarding that.
Yeah. So this is another topic we don't treat at much length in the book. I don't see the problem with having a lot of categories that are available to someone or other. Like, why would you expect there to be only two kinds of animal? And if there can be more than two kinds of animal, maybe there can be more than two human gender categories as well. So I don't think that there's anything super important about keeping the number of your concepts small. Maybe this is me just saying I don't really like desert landscapes as a general approach to ontology. Even though I think like maybe for a particular project you only want to use a small number of concepts. I guess I have a hard time really entertaining. There are just too many ideas in the world that people could draw on. Like, how many ideas are there supposed to be? Why should at some point human cognitive limitations will prevent us from kind of collectively introducing more ideas. There's a finite number of people who presumably all have finite intellects, but I don't think that there's really a risk that we're gonna run out of collective brain space, and that's not really how I treat other areas of inquiry.
Right. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. I mean, there's a point about animals. Like, I mean, we could imagine that our, the way we carved up the different categories of animals was not more fine grained than like a class or an order or something. And then you might say, well, we could carve it up in these more fine ways, and maybe there's some use in doing that because we can, attend to actual differences in those things that we might care about.
Yeah, in a way, sort of hierarchical taxonomies of animals, I think, are really useful for understanding some of what's going on with gender categorization, where for some purposes, you're just like, all right, am I going to the women in philosophy meeting? Well, I should be like something close enough to a woman if I am. And if I don't count as something close enough to a woman, then I shouldn't go to the women in philosophy meeting. And then if you are, I don't know, trying to like have a conversation with a friend who understands you, you might use more fine-grained taxonomy for that. Or if you're, I don't know, if you're going to the like demi-gender non-binary people meetup, maybe then you ask if you're demi-gender, and it's not even a concept you use at the Women in Philosophy meeting.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Fair enough. And then, okay, toward the end, you sort of develop a kind of gender self-determination view. Could you talk a bit about this view and like how it works?
Yeah, so this is kind of a motivation for some of the stuff we say about gender categories, and I think it kind of comes out of a long history of queer theorizing. So the idea is that basically you should get to decide how you are categorized, at least gender-wise. So actually, let me start that over. So the idea is basically that you should get to decide how your gender interacts with the world. So we talk about this mainly in the context of gender categories, but I think most of its advocates have kind of broader ambitions, which I would sign on to. You should also get to decide how your gendered body is in the world to the extent that you can, and sort of which gendered behaviors you participate or don't participate in. and other people shouldn't get to decide for you by projecting their needs and expectations onto you. You should get to express your wishes and have them respected. So that's an evaluative commitment rather than a descriptive commitment.
Yeah, good. I mean, that seems pretty sensible to me. Of course, not everyone's going to agree, but I like. I mean, look, when you say things like, gender self-determination, there's a worry that people might have, and you discuss this a bit in this chapter, which is that isn't this potentially like circular or meaningless? I mean, it's not quite like you're saying something like, well, what it means to be a woman is to believe that you're a woman or something like that, when, there's still this theoretical term woman that is appearing also in the definition, but you're not saying something like that. But anyway, what do you think about the concern there?
Right. Yeah. So the problem it's supposed to create is really for gender categorization rather than for sort of sex biology or gendered behaviors. So the problem is supposed to be, look, if I get to decide whether I'm a woman, a man, both, neither, something completely else, then this threatens to make the concepts of woman and man meaningless. So certainly, like, there are a lot of categories that don't work like this. Like, I don't get to decide whether I have curly hair by declaring that I have curly hair now or that I don't have curly hair now. Like, my hair is some way and maybe I can physically alter it, but I can't just change my category membership by asking to be let into a category without doing anything else. So this would make gender categories work differently from the category of, say, curly-haired person. But that's like, okay, so differently is not really circularly. So we kind of unpack a couple of different, like, well, this doesn't just make these concepts weird, it makes them kind of circular or meaningless objections. And so I think the best thing, so I feel like I may be going on too long. Should I pause here?
No, that's good. Yeah, if you want to say anything more about that, that's fine.
Yeah, so I think the best thing to say here is actually to kind of present our positive picture of what gender categories are, such that you could opt in or out of. Yeah. So actually, sorry, let me start that over. Yeah. So the circularity objection is something like, well, look, if you can get to be a woman or a man or non-binary just by wanting to be or expressing a desire to be, then we don't really have any criteria for being a member of these categories. There is no fact that determines which of these categories you belong to, because you've just defined woman in terms of wants to be a woman or identifies as a woman or considers themselves a woman. So the term is contentless. And so our reply is, so first of all, philosophers actually do have a lot of room for concepts that are kind of circular in this way. So a lot of philosophers have had these kind of response-dependent ideas of like goodness or redness, where to be good is to seem good to more perceivers in morally appropriate conditions with morally appropriate capacities that like really understand what the act in question is. To be red is to look red to ordinary perceivers under ordinary light. And so we've got good in the characterization of good and red in the characterization of red. We need to know some more things about goodness and redness to know exactly what they are. So just saying that little platitude about being red consists of appearing red to ordinary perceivers in ordinary conditions, that doesn't tell you what redness is, but it's compatible with having other information that tells you what redness is. So basically we think that, somebody should count as a man if and only if they consider themselves to be a man. Certainly, if they consider themselves to be a man, sort of sincerely under conditions of like adequate understanding of the concept, they should count as a man. And that's fine because it's not a definition of man. It's just a membership condition in the concept man. It's just like you should get to go in the park if you register and say that you'd like to go in the park is a perfectly good characterization of who's allowed in the park, even though it's circular. It doesn't tell you a definition of what it is to be in the park. It's just a membership condition. So we think similarly, gender self-determination doesn't give you it doesn't give you a definition of any gender category. It just tells you something interesting about gender categories.
Good. Yeah. Okay. And then, yeah, as you say in this chapter, and as I kind of we drew attention to already, is you're sort of against giving like some precise definition or reduction of these gender categories and stuff along those lines. So,
yeah, we think gender self-determination is in fact inconsistent with giving certain kinds of reductive definitions. So, for instance, if I wanted to define manhood or womanhood in terms of like possession of like certain physical bodily organs, well, there are going to be people who have those bodily organs, but who say, I am not a man, a woman, or whatever. And there are also going to be people who don't have those bodily organs and who say, I am a man or a woman or whatever. So because sort of fulfilling the conditions for sincerely declaring or requesting yourself to be a member of the category just comes apart from fulfilling the conditions in the definition. It looks like that definition is at odds with gender self-determination.
Yeah, that seems right to me. But then another worry that someone might have here that I think is distinct from the meaningless or circularity worry is that it's not really saying all that much. It might be kind of empty or trivial if we're just given that, like, okay, here's the conditions under which the label applies to that person. But it's almost like, well, that's not really saying much about, what that means or what the, what that's telling us about the person beyond just the label applies to that person, What do you think about that?
Right. Yeah, so I think that indeed it doesn't tell us much about the meanings of those labels. And so for information about the meanings of those labels, we have to turn elsewhere. And I think we also have a wealth of information that helps us pin down the meanings of the concepts woman, man, non-binary. So we have a bunch of like examples of people in all of these categories. We have a bunch of facts about how these categories are administered and how they have operated through history. And those all are relevant to the meanings of these categories. So you don't learn their meanings by getting a definition. You learn their meanings by going out into the world and using them. But there's another thing in the vicinity that I want to answer, because you might have been asking about it, which is like, why should category membership matter to an individual if it's not about fulfilling somebody's favorite definition? So once I recognize that, like, I don't have to be a man to take testosterone, why should I care about whether I count as a man or not? And there the answer is, well, lots of reasons. People care about their names, even if sort of Mr. Hunter recognizes that his name doesn't mean that he's good at going out and killing animals. That he might still be very attached to his name, Mr. Hunter, because, say, it was his dad's name. And similarly, even if Jane realizes that her being a woman doesn't entail that she goes to women in philosophy talks, or that she experiences and fights sexism, might heavily, I guess, make it highly probable that she experiences and fights sexism, but doesn't entail it. She might think, look, I'm attached to being a woman because it puts me in the same category as like Ruth Bark and Marcus and a lot of my friends. And so it gives me a certain kind of rapport. So I think people can have reasons for caring about their category membership that don't trace back to the definition of the category at all.
Yeah, good. So I was kind of thinking like somewhat along those lines, which is that even if the this principle of category membership is kind of, it doesn't tell you very much about the individual that, is in that category. Nevertheless, these categories and the category memberships don't exist in a vacuum, right? There's still a society around them, and for better or worse, existing gender norms and so on that are connected to the category membership, and all sorts of other, complicated phenomena that are related. And we might care a lot about those things and how those work and how we are situated within those structures in that society. So even if we take an approach like this or another where whether you're what categories you belong to is here is sort of trivial and doesn't tell us a lot about you might still care a lot about where you are in there, and it might be relevant given these other further facts. Maybe it's sort of along the lines of what you're saying there.
Yeah, that's right. Just we know a lot about gender categories that isn't in their membership conditions or in their definitions, but is still knowledge.
Right. I had written some of my kind of brief thoughts here, although it's more along the kind of descriptive lines. And I was wondering, if you want to, I would say get your opinions, but it takes, I wrote down this paragraph and it would take me a minute to get through it.
I'm curious. Yeah.
Okay. So this is all a pretty oversimplification, and I'm paying attention to certain things and not others. So take this where you will.
Yeah.
It seems to me that people over time have developed these rough categories, gender categories, based around, again, kind of rough collection of features that come to be associated with those various categories. And then category membership judgments are then made typically as a result of subconscious heuristics based on the observation and expectation of individuals having these features more or less. And these are going to include things, like, sex characteristics, but also behaviors, social roles, expression, and so on, more or less a lot of gender traits. However, it's not always so easy, because there can be cases where, for which those heuristics don't deliver clear results, right? They don't neatly decide whether someone belongs in one category or another. In particular, when there's some combination of those traits that, isn't clearly associated with one of those categories or another. And then in response to this, people find themselves sometimes, pushed to either just decide those cases as a matter of stipulation, or, come up, develop or make more precise their gender categories or the way they're using these words, so as to decide cases of that sort, right, more broadly. However, issues arise here because, of course, there are many different ways that we might do this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, coming to more today, there are people that are more trans exclusive, and they might want to do that in a way which treats as primary or as the only relevant features, like certain biological or secondary sex characteristics. But, others are more, who prefer a more trans inclusive way to understand the relevant categories might tend to do so in a way that which treat as relevant or important other features like social roles, gender fields, personal identification, and so on. Now, strictly speaking, neither use is like a semantic mistake, right? But some may be more pragmatic, informative, moral, or politically sensible than others. And for those reasons, mostly I prefer the more trans-inclusive uses. But I recognize that such a preference or development, like others of the category's concepts, is just that, a development or precisification, which, while not a strict consequence of prior uses, is legitimate and arguably pragmatic. Right? So, that's kind of roughly some of the thoughts I had. I don't know what you think about all that.
Right. So is the question but are transphobes saying anything literally false when they insist that trans women are not women? Or is the problem not the literal falsehood, but something else?
Well, so I wasn't getting at that, but it's tricky, right? Because sometimes when you'll have a transphobe might say trans people are delusional, but of course, what they're bringing to bear is, or the assumption that they're making is that when they're talking about, say, woman, the category, they're assuming that what the trans person has in mind or what they're committing to is something false. Like, for example, that they have a particular biology when they don't have it. But of course, that's not what they're committing to, right? So then there's some,
Right. And it's a deeply uncharitable interpretation, in fact. Like most trans people kind of know what's up with their bodies.
Right. Yeah, if anything, they're often more aware of it because that's, but I guess what I was kind of getting at here is that, or what I'm wondering if you agree with is that this kind of rough picture of the development of the semantics and why and how it can maybe now is maybe splintering a bit based on the relevance of and more how the frequency of more quote unquote problematic cases. When I say problematic, I just mean cases which weren't maybe on the rough historical uses weren't so easily decided into the categories as they existed. And that has led to people precisifying the concepts in different ways. Maybe that's something like that going on.
Yeah, so I mean, like, intersex people and people socially transitioning have been around for a long time. Medical transition has only been around for maybe like a century, which is, I guess, like on a historical scale, relatively short. So yeah, and I think that different people have different cases closer or further away. So yeah, so probably the best paper to read on this is Talia Betcher's Trans Women and the Meaning of Woman, where she takes a view kind of like the one that you express, where the concept of womanhood is just kind of not a univocal thing, but a thing with many candidate meanings that often aren't sharply distinguished. And you can have like a dominant meaning and a resistant meaning coexisting in the same space where they're both precisified in different ways and trying to do different things. And then there's this question like, well, if you use like the dominant hegemonic meaning and I object to that, can I accuse you of saying something literally false or merely being a jerk who has said something like literally true but really unhelpful? And yeah, I think that's a kind of interesting question that I don't have a settled view on. Like, so if you make an assertion and I am inclined to vigorously insist on the negation of the assertion and to refuse to countenance the assertion, it looks an awful lot like I think that what you said is false. So that's maybe a reason to think that to go for a view that's like, yeah, it's true on your usage of the concept, but it's false because your usage of the concept is wrong in some way. So I can see going that way. I can I am. It feels less good to me to say, oh, it's true on your usage of the concept, and there's nothing ethically wrong with your usage of the concept. Your usage of the concept is just deeply morally flawed. Like that seems. I mean, I think that there are probably like alethic errors in there with the moral errors, but I'm not super confident that I'm making zero alethic errors either. I just think I'm making maybe fewer moral errors on this topic. I'm probably making a lot of other moral errors in my life, not on this topic. So yeah, I think that this is like this is a really interesting question about sort of terms with multiple meanings, where I think that some of the meanings are flawed. Is like, how do I interpret people who are using those meanings? There's also a lot of really interesting stuff on metalinguistic negotiation by Dave Plunkett and Tim Sundell that talks about this puzzle.
Yeah. I was actually, I didn't note it down, but I was thinking about some of the stuff, that sort of issue also, which is that, like, I wonder how much of this discussion I mean, not in the book per se, but in just everyday discourse, also maybe in some of the professional discourse, how much of that is kind of term haggling, how much of that is, and
Right.
I suspect that it's probably more than people assume it to be, but not that that's,
Mhm.
obviously there's more to it than that.
Yeah, I think that it's kind of annoying sometimes how the terms of discussion get set. Like we're all arguing over the extension of the concept woman, and then you've got, I don't know, somebody like Talia Betcher who's writing about how uh, intimacy and privacy uh, shape the way that like our gendered selves interact, which is so much more interesting. And it's not really haggling about the concept of woman, even though she's got that one paper. And so I think like identifying the right questions is a puzzle that I wish we would do better at as a profession.
Yeah. All right. Fair enough. So I just had, I mean, this kind of goes back to the question at the beginning regarding who this is for, but I don't know. I mean, how do you think for people who are either trans or like unsure about how to think about these things for themselves, or like unsure about their, uh, feelings about gender, like how do you think this might be helpful to them? Because it's very much people that are anxious or uncertain or struggle with these things.
Yeah, yeah. So what I want it to do is to sort of assuage their worries that their experience makes no sense. So I think a lot of those worries are caused by like a culture that doesn't furnish concepts to make sense of this like set of experiences that is relatively common, and that we can do better than that. So I think if somebody goes from my experience makes no sense and I'm not entitled to feel the way that I do to um to some place of greater acceptance, like that is my ideal scenario for this book changing somebody's life.
Yeah, very good. That makes a lot of sense. And then, yeah, I'd like to end these interviews with a kind of general metaphilosophical question, which is, what do you think the kind of value of philosophy is? Why is like philosophy like worth doing, perhaps personally or socially, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, oh, that's a great ending question, and so many reasons. uh I think my favorite thing about philosophy is that it provides a space in which I can disagree with other people, and we can kind of move between each other's perspectives. Like that's the thing that I care about in teaching philosophy as well, is teaching it as a form of perspective taking where you get less attached to your way of doing things and more able to step back and see like different alternative ways of seeing. Yeah, so different alternative perspectives, maybe reasons why somebody might reject the conclusion that you believe, and to see them not as hostile but as ways to kind of enrich and support your own thinking. And I think like, and a thing that I like about the book that B and I wrote is kind of related, which is that philosophy doesn't just have to shut down possibilities by proving that they are not real, but can also open up possibilities by providing new vocabulary to make sense of them.
Very, yeah, that's yeah, I like the way you put that. Yeah, that reminds me of some other. A lot of people say things similar to that. I remember when I had Walter St. Armstrong, he said, like, it's part of what it is to understand, why people believe things, to give arguments and to understand each other, and maybe hopefully sometimes gain better understanding and make progress. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I loved it that like I could, when I was an undergrad, go into a philosophy classroom and tell somebody that I thought the thing they believed wasn't true, and instead of getting mad at me, they would ask why and talk me through my objections, and we would see if they were right or wrong.
All right. Very good. So again, the book we've been discussing is called "What Even Is Gender." I'll include some links to that in the description. But yeah, thanks so much for being here, Ray, and taking my questions and writing this book along with Pierre George and giving your thoughtful answers. It's been great having you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on the show.